Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session today. Splunk discusses security operations with Ali Mellon. My name is Kavita. I am a product manager here on the Splunk security team, focused specifically on mission control. Joining me today is Ali Mellon from Forrester. Ali, if you don't mind introducing yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. I'm Ali Mellon. I'm a senior analyst at Forrester. I cover security operations, people, process, technology in the SOC, including EDR, XDR, SIEM, SOAR, security analytics, as well as ransomware, MITRE attack, and nation state threats. I spend all of my time doing research to advise CISOs in the Fortune 500 on their security strategies around detection and response. So thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, we've got a jam-packed agenda today. So over the next couple of minutes, we're going to talk a little bit about the larger scale market dynamics, and then zoom into the realities in the SOC, especially around analyst experience, which I know is a subject both of us are passionate about. We'll segue into talking about Splunk's specific offerings in the area, and then wrap up with a fun conversation about some futures and what our world might look like in the coming years. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Ali, given that you talk to so many different teams at a variety of maturity levels, different company sizes, and different types of orgs, tell us a little bit about what's top of mind for security practitioners today at the CISO level and at the ops level.
Great question. So there's a couple of things that I consistently get asked about, and please keep in mind my bias as we go through these. I cover these specific topics, so I get a lot more questions on them than others. And we have, for example, someone who covers application security, Sandy Carielli, who gets a lot more questions about those pieces. But within these different buckets of my technology areas and around security operations as a whole, the main things that I get questions about are, of course, the technology level. What EDR provider should I use? What is XDR? How should I be thinking about this? What does the evolution of security analytics look like? What are the components of that? And how is that continuing to evolve? How should I think about my security analytics strategy moving forward and my detection and response strategy moving forward? How should I be building new detections or making judgments about how to incorporate different types of telemetry into my security analytics platform? And then once we get into some of the more process-oriented questions, it's a lot around SOC best practices. How should I be organizing my security operations team, both within the SOC and then broader at the security operations level? What does that team need to look like? How can I best make sure that my analysts are prepared to respond faster? How can I improve investigation capabilities? How can I improve analyst experience? And, a lot of questions around what are the barriers to adopting automation in the SOC? That is such a common question. I get so many questions around best practices around automation, because ultimately, even at some of the largest companies in the world, a lot of them don't have the automation expertise within the security team to take advantage of. They end up having someone who is either the SOC manager or even in some instances an analyst who's responsible for deciding what automation they should be using in the SOC and who's been given a mandate to find ways to automate as much as possible. But they need to know best practices around it too and need guidance on next steps. So that one comes up quite frequently, even in the context of SOC best practices. And then lastly, I joined Forrester a little over 2 years ago, and this question comes up continuously all the time, nonstop, which is ransomware. What are some of the things that I need to know when thinking about ransomware defense and a more holistic ransomware defense strategy? Especially early on, I had a lot of clients come to me because, keep in mind, around 2 years ago, even a year ago, there were a lot of ransomware attacks and very public ones hitting a lot of different teams. And the predominant question was, hey, I'm just going to list off all of the things that I have to defend against ransomware. I need you to tell me when I'm missing something, or vice versa. Can you list off all the things that you recommend to defend against ransomware? And I'll stop you when I have questions. And ultimately, it's just not sustainable, right? And so
Yeah.
one of the things that we did at Forrester was develop a framework for ransomware defense. And we've gotten a lot of questions and good feedback on that as a topic, just because it is so important to teams. There's so many challenges that come alongside dealing with a ransomware attack. These are kind of the core market trends that I've seen. How about you? Have you seen these or any others that branch outside of these?
Yeah, we definitely see a lot of what you're seeing, especially in what you talked about around automation maturity. We see mandates for automation, but like you talked about, a lack of practitioners with the experience to do it. Something we'll talk about a little bit later is we're seeing an increased use of automation, but that not necessarily resulting in easier practices for SOC teams, because the requirements on the automation team have grown. The complexity of the environment has grown faster than their ability to automate against it, or because they're not able to find the talent to even fill the automation seats they have. And so we'll talk a little bit about how we're seeing that and a little bit about how we think we can help solve for it with some changes in the SIM space and bringing together automation as a component of products they might already own. Changing the paradigm a little bit about how you think about automation as part of your SOC operations, rather than a separate tool or a separate process that you go through.
That's so true and so interesting. One of the big things that I often talk to clients about is, okay, you've got SOAR, now what? A lot of times they go out and they start to look at automation platforms that they can use without having to find the use cases that they're going to actually address first. And obviously I start the conversation there, but even going beyond that, having the processes defined before you buy is step one, but then updating them is the more important thing that we lose track of and forget, is that you can't just make the processes or define the processes and then automate them and then you're done. They're constant. They should be constantly changing. And without that, you lose your applicability for the automation over time. So 100%, it's a great point. We need to be thinking about this as an ongoing effort as well.
Yeah, and a lot of teams that we see either struggle to even have the documentation for the process, or even if they're able to automate the process, they're only able to automate portions of it. And not the whole process. So they end up with the disjointed situation of documentation for the process, semi-automated processes, and then their regular case operations for other parts of the SOC. And so bringing that all together under a unified experience is a lot of what the Splunk team has been focusing on to avoid this disjointed nature, especially for the analysts, which can be especially burdensome for them. But actually, this consolidation and this unification is something we're seeing not just in the automation space, but kind of in the SIM space as a whole. You've talked about a bunch of these different parts of the industry that you talk about with your CISO discussions today. How do you really see the SIM market having evolved? What parts of this constitute the SIM market? What should we be thinking about when we think SIM today?
Good question. The market has been around for a long time. Since, in this slide, you can see dating back to as early as 1995, if not in some cases even earlier, with what some teams were doing. And it's evolved a lot in that time, right? Very early on, it was focused on these two separate elements, which were more perimeter focused and more compliance focused, before combining into more of the enterprise defense model that we've seen classically with SIM. Now, a lot of that changed in 2015 when my now boss was covering this space and defined the term security analytics platforms, which he saw as the combination of the SIM capability, user behavior analytics capabilities, and SOAR, that automation orchestration part. And at the time, it made a lot of sense, right? Because one of the big challenges is you have this tool where you can bring in all this data and you can build rules against it, in some cases build analytics against it, although at that time not nearly as much as now. And the next step after that was, okay, but what about response? How are you actually going to do the response element? And so that's really where we saw SOAR come into play and make this a true security analytics platform, a platform that was able to do more than just that analytics and detection piece, but extending into the areas of response. And so we talk about security analytics platforms as that combination, the SIEM, the UBA, the SOAR, and in some cases, additional security analytics on top of that. But what we've seen most recently, and if you transition a couple of slides, what we've seen most recently is a move to incorporate threat intelligence platforms into this as well, and a consolidation motion happening with those pieces as well. So now many of the major players in the SIEM and security analytics platform market incorporate all of these pieces, right? They have the base SIEM for the data ingestion and data storage. They have the threat intelligence piece layered on top of it, not so much the feeds, but the actual ability to integrate the feeds that you're looking for, to give you that flexibility to integrate the feeds that you're looking for. The UBA capabilities, which are so useful for actually understanding user behavior better and being able to make judgments on what's happening based on those. And the SOAR piece to automate, like we're going to talk about a little later, not just response, but also investigation, and to help analysts have better workflows for analyst experience. And then all around that is, of course, the whole premise of the security analytics platform. So the market has changed quite a bit over the last 20 years for sure, and even over the last 10, over the last 5, to become more of a holistic platform. And that's what we see most commonly is, if you look at the majority of SOCs, the one tool you know they're going to have is that security analytics platform, that SIEM, that SOAR, that UBA, because it gives them the flexibility that they need to build new rules, to build playbooks, to bring in whatever data for detection that they need, and then obviously to do threat hunting and other tasks on top of that.
I'm curious about what you see in terms of trends of adoption here. Do you see single vendor adoption, or do you tend to see customers looking to find best of breed at the component level, even if a single vendor offers multiple?
For sure, the SIEM and UBA combination, we've seen total consolidation there. So it's very rare to see someone have a SIEM and a UBA that don't belong together in the security analytics piece as well. Some do, but it's much rarer than others. The threat intelligence platform piece has been a much easier addition as well. And we've seen a lot of teams who are opting to just use the integrated threat intelligence capability from that vendor, as opposed to trying to go out and buy another tip. Now, the interesting part is with SOAR, because this has been, in many cases, it's a separate purchase, although for others, it makes sense for it to be an integrated purchase. So a lot of it depends on the quality of the SOAR that the vendor is providing, and whether or not it has the integrations that they need, it has the compatibility with the platform they need. And while we see, and of course have seen, the consolidation continuing to happen, ultimately, if the SOAR's quality isn't high, and we haven't really seen the market stability with SOAR of the depth and breadth of integrations, and of the depth and breadth of playbooks that are available, and workflows that you're able to create, then customers are going to look elsewhere. So there are still a few SOAR providers, who many of which have an existing security analytics platform offering, who reign supreme across any different type of SIEM and have the most well-used SOAR capability. But often if the SOAR capability is strong, the client will go with the same security analytics platform for the SOAR, because the integration quality you can get between those two tools is so high.
Interesting. And we definitely see pieces of that with our own SOAR. So this definitely mirrors what we're seeing today. Though we do see a move, especially with recent economic forces, to more of a consolidation on single vendor. I think that's been a more recent trend in the last couple months or a year or so. How do you tell a CISO or guide a CISO or a team who's looking to purchase these products on as to which ones they should purchase, and what's your methodology behind giving that guidance?
Great question. So I recently, as of Q4 of 2022, published the Forrester Wave on security analytics platforms. This is our review of the security analytics and SIM market. We had 14 different vendors as part of this evaluation, and we evaluated a couple of key pieces, right? The current offering that they have, the strategy that they have for the future, and then their market presence. So you can see strategy on the bottom moving to the right. You can see current offering moving up. And ultimately, this evaluation was very interesting because we had a similar wave, and we typically do update these on a 2-year basis. So we had a similar wave 2 years ago, but the results are pretty dramatically different, to be honest. It's very different results for most vendors in the evaluation than we saw 2 years ago, because despite many talking about this and talking about SIM as kind of a more legacy market, there's so much going on here. There's so many changes going on here. There's a lot of really valuable things for clients to better understand, and for people who are using these tools to better understand. So through this evaluation, I had a lot of different criteria. I had 28 in total. So basically, each vendor was evaluated on 28 different parts of their current offering and strategy and market presence. And it covered a lot of ground, in part because, just as we were just discussing, there are so many different parts of a security analytics platform that there's a lot of ground to cover. But the 3 most important things that I found throughout this evaluation were the following, right? These following criteria. So the first was the depth and breadth of integrations and log collectors, and really just of the offering generally. So this one is always one of the top things that I get asked about, which is, okay, are these integrations, are these log collectors available in this tool? And are they actually working as intended? And it was a common theme in the wave. Is some of the main complaints that I heard from customers are, we just don't know when this is working, or we have to do a lot of coding on the back end to make sure that it is. And so finding vendors that were able to balance having the breadth of integrations and log collectors available, and that depth in what they were able to collect or integrate with, really, really prime and important in this evaluation. The second piece was, of course, analyst experience. How are you making sure that the analyst can take an alert from start to finish, and that they are doing a good job at it? Are you making sure that triage is easier for them? Are you making sure that investigation is easier for them, that response is easy to automate or orchestrate depending upon the use case? How are you enabling things like training for the client? Because ultimately, and this is very important, one of the challenges that we have is communicating, okay, so how does analyst experience differ from just the UX of the tool itself? And there's a big difference, because analyst experience isn't just about what's happening in the tool. It's also about the training that's available to get that analyst to the next level and to make sure that they stay. It's about the career path that they have within the organization. We make the whole concept very CISO oriented, and UX and tools is just one piece of that. So one of the interesting factors here was training came up a lot. Training and community came up so much in this evaluation as one of the most important things that CISOs look for. I had so many CISOs who said, this vendor's training is really good, and so I have every single new analyst take that training as part of their onboarding. That's incredibly valuable if you can provide that level of quality without even having the analyst step into your offering yet. That is something really, really impressive, and that was really great about many of the vendors in the evaluation. And then lastly is product vision. And anybody who's seen any of my waves will know that I consistently use this as one of my most important criteria. It relates to strategy, of course. And ultimately, the way that I see product vision is through the lens of some of the customer interactions that I've had throughout these waves. So I have obviously seen a lot of different vendors in these waves. And one of the things that I do is when I see a vendor that doesn't have the best product in the market, I'll often ask the customer, why do you stay with this vendor? What makes you want to use this vendor? And every time without fail, it is the vision. They say the vendor's vision is something that they believe in, they think they can get to, they think has value. And that's what makes that such an important criteria for me, is that ultimately the vision is something that should be leading the product. It should be leading the planned enhancements. It should be tied to what the product is delivering on, what the company as a whole delivers on, their DNA, and it should be something that's actually achievable. So those are the three main criteria that are the most important throughout this evaluation. Although, just like I said, there are 25 different others that you can review and look at. But there was a lot that I was able to see just through those three that gave a lot of perspective on the market.
That's really cool. I'm especially glad that you're including things like training. I think that, as we've talked about for years in the industry, it's people, process, and technology coming together to really make this work for a SOC team, and for other teams, but it's in particular in security. And I think that, like you said, it's not just about providing the tool, but actually making sure that the analyst can use it easily, onboard properly, etc. I'm curious about how you weigh things like complexity with the training. Products that tend to be more mature or sometimes more complex might require more training. How do you balance that increased functionality with the need for more training? Is that a good thing, a bad thing?
Well, it's interesting. So one of the things that led to the analyst experience research was a review of some of Forrester's data. So every year we do a yearly security survey of security leaders and decision makers, thousands of them, right? And we ask a bunch of questions. And one of the questions, of course, besides like what are your challenges? What are your successes? What's going on for the year? One of the questions is, what do you use to make purchasing decisions? And one of the most important ones that came up was the training available and whether or not there was quality training available. That was so important to CISOs making these decisions, in part because a lot of the tools are too hard to use. Yeah. And they need training. And if they don't have training, their team is never going to get use out of it. So in some cases, there's more complexity than others in specific tools. Most of them are pretty aligned to, like, the complexity is pretty aligned to the capability. But all of that said, it comes down to a balance of, is the training available? Is the product easy to use, even with or without the training? And then what is the cost of that training? Is the training affordable, especially with what you're given? And those three things, along with the difficulty in actually using the product, are important to balance all together. I think you can get away with a bit more of a complex tool if the training is really high quality and ramps them up really quickly, and is cost effective and is easier. The barrier to entry is lower, right? Whereas if it's a really complex tool and the training is convoluted, people just aren't going to do it.
Yeah. Well, I don't envy you having to go through understanding the training for all of the vendors. You're probably the most trained analyst out there. But one of the things we see a lot in terms of training and the difficulty with training is the use of MSS service providers in order to sub in for some of the analyst team, or to provide and fill analysts where they might have gaps in their capabilities. Do you make recommendations on when a team should consider an MSS versus actually bringing those experiences in-house?
Yeah. With this particular question, I tend to broaden it to any service provider that they might want to use, whether it's an MSSP or an MDR provider or just a consultancy or what have you. I think about the future of security operations as augmented with a service provider of some kind. Ultimately, you could be one of the biggest companies in the world. Most often they do have some type of service provider supporting them in some way within security operations, whether it's just, hey, we're going to do the threat hunting for you, or, hey, we're just going to be building some of these detection rules for you. It's important to have a balance with that, right? Because one of the things that I think a lot about is your security operations team in-house has a certain capacity. You're able to accomplish a certain amount. That may be 24/7, that may not be 24/7. In the event of an incident, that those capacity requirements change. And so you need to be able to adapt to those situations effectively. There's a lot you can do to manage that load internally, but at a certain point, it becomes more cost effective to have some of that outsourced. And just as you mentioned, in some of these cases, it's easier to say, hey, I want my service provider to do all the L1 level activities and just have my team address the L2, L3, maybe taking response actions. So depending on the size company, it varies dramatically. You know, for a much less mature security team that probably doesn't have a SOC, probably not going to recommend they do everything in-house. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, for a much more mature team, probably going to recommend that they have some level of interaction with an MDR provider or an MSSP, especially around things like detections for emerging technologies. So if you think about the cloud 10 years ago and the companies that were starting to move to the cloud 10 years ago, they didn't really have any tools that could detect attacks in the cloud. We still have limited capabilities around there, but they could have a threat hunter come in from one of these companies that has a little bit more knowledge and understanding of the environment, potentially has some cloud expertise, and start doing threat hunting there or start building detections there. So there are use cases where even for the largest companies, it makes a lot of sense to have those capabilities outsourced to a certain extent, but balancing it with that internal knowledge that you just can't get from a third-party provider.
Yeah, I think when bringing in a third-party provider, one of the difficulties I see folks have, even if they're able to offload a lot of operations or even administrative type work, is the handoff between the third-party provider and the internal team, especially when it is a true positive incident. And now suddenly the internal teams need the full context and depth to be able to go deep on that particular incident. So definitely something we see a lot, but something that has a couple of hurdles in establishing those processes. And someplace I think tools can actually fill the gaps to enable those transitions a little bit more smoothly. But transitioning into our favorite topic of analyst experience, and just wrapping up the topic of security analytics and the market dynamics as a whole, what do you see as coming next?
There are three things that I'm seeing security teams face a lot of challenges with, and therefore are definitely going to be a part of the future of security analytics. The first is using SOAR. A lot of teams get a lot of value out of SOAR. A lot of teams struggle with automation in the SOC. And the key to that is to try and take automation down to a smaller and more atomic level. So approaching it from the standpoint of what are the little tasks that I can automate that can build into a bigger playbook, as opposed to building a huge playbook straight out of the gate. And so discrete and targeted automation to reduce load on analysts is the first important piece of this. The second is the security expertise that's available in the offering. During the wave, one of the things that I highlighted was that we're really starting to see more security expertise and capabilities infused into security analytics platforms. And that comes with this element of analyst experience. And so that is the second really key thing that we're going to see, is just the continued push to incorporate more context and give more visibility and make sure it's presented at the right time and in the right place that makes the most sense for the analyst workflow. And then lastly, collaboration, enabling collaboration, not just for internal to the security team, but also with other teams outside of security, like DevOps, making sure that when an incident is perhaps classified as a security incident, but ends up being a DevOps issue, making sure that that handoff is available and easy to transition to. And we're going to see this a lot more, especially with observability. And as that starts to creep into the security realm and security starts to become interested in that data, making sure that those transitions happen well with both DevOps, security, and fraud, going to be very, very important.
Let's dive into some specifics around the analyst experience and what that's like. I know you spent a lot of time in this area, specifically around the 5 components of the security analyst experience. Can you remind us of what those are and just kind of give us a highlight?
Definitely. So one of the things that pushed me and my colleague Jeff Pollard in the direction of doing this research was better understanding some of the challenges that analysts are facing. So I mentioned the security survey that Forrester does every year of thousands of security decision makers. One of the questions that we ask is, what takes the most time in your organization's incident alert and response process? And far and above, as you can see, the answer was analysis or investigation. It takes up so much time compared to detection, containment, recovery, eradication. And yet it's often the last thing that we talk about, right? With a lot of these tools, it's detection and response, and investigation is an afterthought or just considered a piece of response. But ultimately, it needs to stand on its own because we see so many analysts really struggling with that, taking up so much of their time. A big part of the investigation element is that you can do investigation quickly, you can do it completely. It's very difficult to do both at the same time, right? It's difficult to understand the entire context of an incident within 5 minutes, yeah. Especially if you have to do a lot of that work manually. So that's what led to our introduction of analyst experience, which is a security analyst's perception of the tools and processes and services that they work with on a regular basis. And we split this up into 5 different pieces, just as you mentioned. There's discover, explore, classify, determine, and execute. The whole premise of this is when you're thinking about what an analyst does, break up that workflow and that process into multiple elements, and then look at ways that you can improve each element. And one of the cool things about this is that we do this exercise with a lot of CISOs that want to break down everything that their analysts are doing and look for ways to improve it piece by piece. And they have particular requirements. They're like, I really want to make sure that they're responding thoroughly. And so we focus on that execute piece, or exploring and understanding triaging well, and we focus on that piece. But it breaks it down in a way that's a little bit more achievable than just looking at the entirety of the process and saying, okay, what now? Now, one of the other things that's really important about the concept is you can see that these are pretty vague, right? Discover, explore, classify, determine, execute doesn't sound super specific to security or to security operations, and that's very intentional. We wanted to make sure that across everything that security operations is doing, this can apply. So I've applied this particular model to detection and response. I've applied it to the threat hunting role, to detection engineering, to some of the interlocks that we see with VRM teams. It's meant to be usable for more than just the detection and response workflow on its own, although that's the immediate one where we see value and we see it being really useful. So when we think about each of these pieces, if you look at Discover, the context we put around that is to build a premise on which to test an idea. For Explore, it's validate findings and confirm the results of a hypothesis. Classify, analyze the available details, determine severity. Determine, make a determination on what steps need to happen next, and then execute, take the appropriate actions. And what this manifests as, when you look at the specific application of analyst experience to detection and response, is, let's think about the analyst workflow. What is the first thing they do? They review the queue. Is it easy for them to review the queue? Do they know what they need to choose? One of the interesting things that I did in the first wave that I did for Forrester, which was on XDR vendors, was I asked a couple of questions for them, because what we typically do is we build scenarios during the wave process, and then we ask vendors to recreate those scenarios to show us their features for what a security analyst would really use the platform for and what it would look like. And so I made up 2 scenarios. The first one was, I'm a really green analyst. What is the first thing that I do when I'm trying to figure out within the queue what's achievable for me? How do I know which alert I'm going to be able to accomplish if it's my first or second or third day on the job? The second scenario was the opposite. I am a veteran analyst. I want to show off today. I want to choose something that's going to be really hard. I want to really dig into the details of something. I want something that's high impact. Which one do I choose? It was really hard to figure out what an analyst should be doing depending upon their level of experience and their level of knowledge. And so when we think about the queue and how they can review the queue, making that determination and making it easier for them to make that determination can extend from what you're giving them in the product all the way to the procedures that you have in place to make sure that they know what to look for when they're going through the queue in a particular set of alerts. The second piece of this is the triage one, which often also gets overlooked as part of this process. But how are we actually determining that this is something real, that this is something that we need to care about, that this is something that we either need to escalate or need to close out, and something that maybe a L1 analyst can close out? Making a determination about whether an alert is real or an incident is real or not is a piece that needs to happen very quickly, especially in very critical situations, and very important here. And the third one is classify. So escalate. How do you know how to escalate? Coming back to what we talked about earlier, when thinking about the case management aspects, how are you enabling that collaboration? So if it is an incident, you can say, hey, L3, I need you to look at this right now because I'm not sure what's going on, but I think it's a problem. How do you make that transition? And do you have to go into a completely separate tool to do so? The fourth step is the actual investigation. What has to take place for the investigation to occur? What is being shown to the analyst quickly, or what can they execute, such as a playbook, to make sure that that investigation gives them the context that they need about a particular instance of an attack? And lastly, respond. How do they execute that response? Do they have to go to 50 different boxes to actually execute the response, or can they do it from a centralized place? All of these pieces feed into what ultimately becomes the analyst experience of the product, of the processes, of their role in your organization. And they all have opportunities to be improved. And ultimately, they all feed into this question of, is the analyst going to burn out? Are they going to learn something today? Are they going to get to the next level in their career? And so we look for ways to improve each piece of that puzzle.
Yeah. If I'm a SOC manager, what kind of metrics should I be watching to make sure that I'm hitting these all 5 of these different components, and that my analysts aren't actually going too fast? We've seen some concern as there's an emphasis on MTTR across the industry, that some of, like you said, the more paranoid members of our industry and SOC managers are saying, hey, those kinds of alerts are being triaged really fast. Are we actually spending the time to review the incident correctly? What kind of metrics can help watch for things like that or other gotchas?
Yeah, so metrics are a really interesting piece of this because I also get a lot of questions around those. And most often, right, mean time to remediate is important. Mean time to investigate is important, of course. Mean time to detect, especially when you're thinking about it in the context of detection engineering, like, do you have the visibility you need to detect a particular threat? And if you do, does it get the full context of an attack or just one piece of that? Those, weaving those together are important. But the other piece that I find is that things like repeat occurrences of incidents is another thing that's very important to track, because that can give you insight into perhaps if part of an attack was missed, or if the appropriate mitigation actions aren't being taken. It can also give you the business case to make sure that they are taken by IT or by other teams. The last piece of this is quality. This is something that I talk a lot about when talking about the future of the SOC, and what the future of the SOC looks like is, how do you think about quality and what quality you're bringing to the response actions that you take and the alerts that you're closing out? We do get caught up into that one dimension of response and of time to respond, but ultimately measuring that quality in the form of repeat incidents and actions taken and actions that are able to be automated versus those that aren't comes into play very importantly here.
One of the things, Ali, that I wanted to chat a little bit about is where you see the space going, especially in light of some of the advancements in AI and LLMs like ChatGPT. I know we've been using it in some cool ways on the Splunk side. I've seen a lot of blogs and interest around this from other folks in the security space. How do you see this becoming a part of the analyst experience and the SOC experience?
When this first came out, I definitely saw the tie-ins, and I sound like a broken record at this point to analyst experience because ultimately it just makes it more of a human experience, right? It enables you to ask questions of the environment that makes sense to you and to your role and to what you're doing without having to create a query and basically operate under the constraints that the product wants you to operate on, which is great. I think that piece of this is really important and has a lot of potential to help analysts make better decisions faster, to start being a little bit more predictive about what analysts should be doing, to analyze what they are doing, what's working well, what isn't, to, just as I mentioned, query the environment and say, hey, we have this new vulnerability. Is this affecting us, and how? Is this something that we can figure out? And then on a broader level, down to things like making documentation easier for security teams. One of the underrated aspects that I think there's a lot of potential for here is documentation, because documentation is awful. Like, it's one of the most annoying parts of the job. And wouldn't it be great if we just had a computer doing that for us? And so there's a ton of potential to reduce some of these kind of boring tasks that nobody enjoys and just relegate them to the AI or to machine learning, and focus on the really cool things like reverse engineering malware as an example.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that. One of the things we've been using it for is to develop an open API spec for Splunk tools that didn't have them previously, and even for third-party tools that we wanted to be able to leverage and automate against. So the documentation part of this is definitely going to be apparent, I think, in fairly short order. And one of the things we talked about earlier was thinking of an MSSP just like any other service provider that might augment your team. Kind of how I've been thinking about some of the tools that are coming out as like an augmentation or like a service provider almost, in that it can augment your team, whether it be in terms of filling roles that are hard for you to fill, in terms of gaining that expertise, or to offload some of the work so that your team can do some of the higher order work, which I think is pretty common today. One of the things we have seen, though, is that it is also, as with everything in security, if it's an opportunity for us to improve, it's an opportunity for the adversary to improve. Things like using these types of tools for better phishing campaigns or more complex attacks. Do you see that becoming a problem in the short term?
In the short term, yeah, I think we're already starting to see it become or be used in that way. And any easy button the attacker will always take. The other piece of this that's really interesting too is the potential for things like data poisoning for machine learning algorithms, and starting to kind of attack the machine learning algorithms themselves. We've seen a little bit in this area. It's still so new and so early that most of the clients that I talk to are not equipped to handle that just yet, with some obvious exceptions. But it is an interesting element of this where it's like, as we evolve to using these technologies that we understand even less than, or the majority of us understand even less than the technologies that we understand today, which are very, by comparison, a lot less complex. It poses a lot of potential for attackers in unique ways and makes our job as defenders much more difficult, and also requires us to have a much even stronger understanding of all of the new technologies that are being created and how they work, so that we can better defend them.
Yeah, another cool use case we've been exploring is around testing, actually. How can we use AI and other tools like this to generate a better corpus of test data to simulate attacks and things like this, to make sure that the content we put out or the tools we develop are even friendlier and maybe more robust. So I think that that's something that is a positive outcome of it, but like you said, is definitely something that the attackers are going to take advantage of as well. Kind of in light of this and other trends that we've talked about, what do you think the life of a security analyst will be in 2030?
Oof, 7 years. I hope it's going to be different. I genuinely do. I feel like one of the challenges we've had is that it's like data volumes are increasing and it just makes the analyst job harder and harder. So I hope that a lot of the advancements in AI and machine learning that we're seeing are going to be a huge benefit. One of my fears with some of the use cases for generative AI is that, well, while there's a lot of potential for it to be really beneficial, there's also a lot of potential for it to be kind of novel and just interesting for a little while and then not very useful. And so I have a lot of hope that it will be very useful and it will give a lot more context for analysts and ability to interact with the environment and understand the environment a lot better, especially in 7 years' time. But I am hesitantly optimistic about it. What do you think?
Yeah, I hope for the same things you do. And I hope we're not here in 7 years talking about why the analyst job is still so difficult. And we've moved on to talking about a different role being difficult. But I do think that a lot of the more rote parts of the job can really be handled by some of this. And hopefully that leaves more room to give the analysts that 15-20% to actually explore more complex parts of the job. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on here with us. This was a great chat. I learned a lot from you, and I'm sure the rest of the audience will too. And so one of the ways that the Splunk team is kind of approaching this problem is to say, instead of thinking of these as siloed tools, let's bring them together under this banner of unified security operations and think of them as capabilities under a single unified experience. So whether that's traditional SIM capabilities, SOAR capabilities, UBA, threat intel, all of it falls under this banner of unified security operations. And we have one interface that does all of it. And in this way, they're able to think about it as just one work surface, less context switching, less management and mental overhead of different tools, and focus on actually servicing the right information, making sure that automation is really an integrated part of this solution and not a separate tool that they're trying to plug in, and to make sure that the automation is digestible in a way that they can actually adopt it and mirror their SOC processes, mature their SOC processes, and have automation just be part of that journey as opposed to a separate effort. So the way Splunk has approached this unified SecOps is with a product called Mission Control, which brings together SIM and SOAR capabilities. And the hallmarks of Mission Control are really three core things. The first one is unification. So this is the basics of bringing together all these products. So it's SIM, the Splunk core platform that does search and dashboarding, UBA capabilities, threat intel capabilities, SOAR capabilities, all into one tool. And then not only does it unify these tools and the UIs for you so that you don't have to manage the data plumbing and you have one convenient UI to work off of, but it also simplifies the response process. We've talked about the importance of response and how critical it is that analysts have documented procedures, straightforward paths to be able to get to remediation that take them through all the various steps of investigation as well, and steps that are repeatable, easy to understand. Mission Control includes a lot of this built in and includes tools for you to be able to mature these processes as they change and as your team grows and changes as well. So a lot of simplification and process-oriented tooling in Mission Control as well. And then finally, modernization. As you get better about documenting those processes, auditing them, managing them, monitoring them, we want to make sure that you're able to modernize with the tool as well. So this is really embedding automation wherever you can to offload workloads from the analyst to the tool, and to make sure that intelligence is integrated throughout, both on the detection side and on the context remediation side. So let's dive in a little bit more into what Mission Control is and how it works, and give you a closer look at how Splunk is addressing some of these things. So when a user first clicks into Mission Control, they're met with the queue. We've spoken about the queue a couple of times on today's call and its criticality in how analysts get started on their work. So in Mission Control, the queue is front and center. And users can customize the queue to make sure it highlights the incidents that are most critical to them, ones that they can work and ones that they have processes for. So you can use the fields displayed here, or users can configure customizations here on what data they'd like to see in order to make sure that they're able to do their jobs quickly. They can also preview any incident at a glance to be able to see what the details of the specific incident are to make a better decision about who should work it, whether they want to take it, hand it off to a teammate, set a status, etc. We also track SLAs for every incident, and users can use that as a guidance on where they might want to start if something's about to expire. Now, the data in the queue comes from our SIM ES. So all of the incidents here have already gone through the correlation process. But let's dive into an investigation. Mission control really deals in that realm post-detection. So we're going to select this specific incident and take a look in a little bit more detail. Once I open the incident as an analyst, I have a series of features that are going to help me do my investigation and tell me what the steps are and how to proceed. Now, the whole mission control interface is really designed for the security analyst, and that's the persona that we've built most of these capabilities around. So front and center is the key data values that they need in order to just get their bearings on what this incident is. So this is all data coming from our SIM, plus any enrichments that they've added in the form of custom fields, data they might need to fill out, categorization information, etc. Most users come over here and start in this response section. Now, this response section is home to a feature called response templates. And response templates are the heart of case management in mission control. A response template is a series of phases, and then within each phase, a set of tasks that analysts need to accomplish as part of their investigation. This is essentially the SOP process documentation of the SOC codified in the product. The reason this is helpful is because, one, process documentation, like we talked about, is likely to change over time as teams mature and as their tools and mechanics mature. And so having it in the tool be something that everyone looks at every day makes it easy to change and keeps your eyes on it in case the processes have changed. Secondly, if you're a new analyst, you know exactly what you need to do first. You know exactly what your steps are. You don't need to reference an external wiki or Google Doc in order to find where you need to start with your investigation. And then as a SOC manager, we've talked a little bit about metrics today and what kind of metrics SOC teams needs to be wary of and watching for. All the data you see here about starting a task, stopping a task, filling out notes, files, etc., all of that is tracked in mission control. So not only is Splunk home to your data itself, but now it's also home to this case management data. And you can use similar reporting, dashboarding, searching mechanics in Splunk to be able to get at the data to find trends about which tasks are taking your team the longest, where the dwell times are, what the MTTR is, and where you might want to focus your processes on optimizations, collaborations with other teams, or on automation. Not only does Mission Control provide you the mechanics to be able to do this process documentation by allowing you to build your own response templates and customize them to how your team wants to operate, but we also allow you to help the analyst actually do the task, which comes in the form of three different things. They're embedded in this respond portion here. And the three things that can help an analyst actually complete a task are automation playbooks, automation actions, and Splunk searches. As an example, in this particular task, I have a playbook that's embedded here. This playbook leverages the fact that Mission Control ships with a SOAR instance pre-configured inside of it. So, but when I click this play button, it kicks off an automation playbook that's been built and embedded in this response template. So I know it's already part of this process. I didn't have to know any details about the playbook or about the mechanics of how to build or write playbooks. Somebody on my content team or someone from Splunk has already taken care of that for me if you're using one of our out-of-the-box playbooks. And you can see that a playbook ran. I can dive into the details here in this automation tab. But more importantly, my task is now started for me and even completed for me. And the playbook even left a note for me. So as an analyst, my job got easier. One of the things Ali mentioned earlier is that you actually want to build your automations task by task. And that's something we see all the time at Splunk. We see users struggle to build these monolithic playbooks that really take a full use case end to end, because it takes a lot of coordination with other teams. It takes a lot of automation maturity to be able to do something like that. What's more realistic for most teams is to be able to automate task by task. So this framework with response templates of tasks, plus the ability to embed automation at the task level, really allows you to decide where you're going to get the best bang for your buck in terms of automation, and allows you to implement the automation in bite-sized pieces in a way that's more consumable. You can then start your automation journey by, for example, automating all of your context gathering or enrichment tasks, but leave your remediation tasks to be manual for now. And as you move in your automation journey and mature, you can then convert those tasks to also being automation. Eventually, maybe having the automation engine do all the tasks for you. But this mix of completely automated to completely manual tasks and everything in between is something that Mission Control puts front and center so that it covers your journey no matter where you are with each use case. Now, in addition to this framework, Mission Control, like I mentioned, allows you to embed automation, but also allows you to embed Splunk searches. We embed Splunk searches throughout the product. For example, I can click on this contributing event search, and any search link takes you into the search page in Mission Control. Now, this is your full Splunk search experience, just as you know it, right in the Mission Control product. So when your investigations get hairy, when you need to interrogate the data, the raw data, find adjacent information, etc., you have the capability of doing that in the same tool without any pivoting. And then, as an analyst, if I find a raw event that is relevant to my investigation, I can add it to my Mission Control incident. So I'm going to go ahead and add it to this incident. And when I do that, the raw event is now going to be stored as part of the Mission Control incident. This means that as a manager or as a lead or as an analyst who's picking up this investigation, I can see that raw data in conjunction with the rest of my investigation data. I don't need to rerun a search or anything in order to see it. So I can see this event right here. I can refer back to it if I need to, and I can do more analytics or automation against this data if I need to. Not only can events from search be added here, but events from third-party tools can also be added here using automation. And so this events listing inside the incident is home to both events added from search and events added from third parties through automation. So you have all of your context data also in one place. So I can go right into the incident by clicking on this intelligence tab. And then I can find here a hash that I'm interested in and view my intelligence data right here. Now, historically, this would have had to be either another SOAR action or a pivot into another tool to get this information. My Mission Control pre-populates this intelligence information for all of the relevant objects in this incident for the analyst. Again, trying to bring that context to them so they don't have to go find it, make their lives a little bit easier. And overall, the focus of Mission Control is really to streamline that operational process for the analyst by providing them the mechanics to understand everything that they need to about the detection, have a documented, templated process for their response so they know exactly what to do, and give them tools within each of those tasks to be able to actually complete those tasks and complete their investigation, and then update the status or disposition based on their investigation results. So that's a preview into Mission Control and how it works with some of the key topics that we've talked about today.